Left of the box. So there's also an attack on people who live with poverty in this country, in this province. But, in this country as a whole, but very specific examples of it in this province. This was a story I was covering where Doug Ford is threatening to use the notwithstanding clause to take away people's protected rights for people who live in encampments, to basically say, okay, you have no rights, and round them up and just throw them in jail, not even with treatment. And he dared the mayors of big cities to have him do that, almost like that way he can have some plausible deniability, like, it wasn't me who wanted it. It was all these mayors. I was just doing what they asked me to do, even though he said, ask me to do it. Well, again, the steps are in process for him to do just that. This is from CTV News. Enough is enough. Doug Ford says municipalities will be given enhanced tools to respond to encampments.
Issue affecting cities across the province, and after a number of Ontario's mayors asked the province for help, the Premier announced today there will be new legislation to help municipalities deal with homeless encampments. CTV's Queen's Park Bureau Chief Siobhan Morris joins us now with the details. Siobhan.
Well, mayors all over Ontario agree they need more help to deal with the problem of homelessness. There's less consensus, though, about what exactly that help should look like. We'll get a better idea of what the Premier has in mind in the final days of the legislative session next week.
The government's preparing legislation for next week to crack down on homeless encampments. The Association of Municipalities of Ontario counted 1,400 of them last year.
1,400 encampments last year in a province of 14 million. 1,400 encampments. Like, that is a crisis. It is an absolute crisis.
We've heard the people of the province of Ontario loud and clear. We've heard from our municipal friends loud and clear. They want the encampments cleared out.
There are promises for more funding for shelter space, tools for police to crack down on illegal drugs in public.
Keep in mind, they want, we need more tools to crack down on people using drugs in public when they're closing down supervised consumption sites, shutting down 10 of the 17 of them in Ontario. Where do you think they go if they don't have those sites to go to? A lot of these things, these policies, these legislations put in place almost force people in these situations, people who are unhoused. It makes them into criminals by simply existing and trying to get by.
Penalties for those who continually break the law, and new approaches to treatment and rehab.
We think that the resources that we're providing next week and the enhancements that we're providing next week will allow our partners to remove encampments.
So Doug Ford says he doesn't think he'll have to use the notwithstanding clause to override the charter, but it's a tool he is prepared to reach for if necessary. Earlier this fall, the Premier dared mayors to ask him to.
Let's see if they have the backbone to do it.
A 2023 court decision blocks municipalities from clearing encampments unless there's a shelter space for the homeless to go to.
This is an incredible step forward.
The mayor of Barrie, one of more than a dozen who asked the Premier for these measures.
They have to be used incredibly cautiously. They have to be well organized. And we need to make sure that we're continually investing.
The mayor of Toronto, skeptical.
We don't need to clog up our courts to deal with encampments.
Condemning the contemplation of the notwithstanding clause.
Help us build more supportive housing. Help us create more shelters. Help us bring people indoor. At the end of the day, that is what will work.
For the provincial opposition, the devil's in the details.
I want to see what he's offering up, but if there are not real housing solutions included in that legislation, then we're going to have to keep pushing for that.
There are also accusations more financial help for cities comes too late.
Now we're at a crisis point, and the Premier's solution is to tell people to leave when they have no place to go.
There should have been a strategy years ago, not months ago, with funding attached.
The Ford government last invoked the notwithstanding clause 2 years ago to try and prevent a strike by school support workers. They ultimately had to back off that move after national outcry. Reporting live from Queen's Park, I'm Siobhan Morris. Zoraida, back to you.
Thank you, Siobhan.
So they mentioned a court case that happened last year, and I covered it at the time. So court rules Region of Waterloo can't evict people from encampment due to lack of shelter space. And so it basically, this encampment in particular that they were ruling on was on regional land. So the municipality had nothing to do with it. And they basically determined that if there were no suitable shelter spaces for people to go to, then they have a right to stay in the encampment. Things that would make a shelter space suitable are things like, are they pet friendly? Can you have your belongings? Like there are, in some cities, there are shelter spaces available, but they're not accessible to people. They're not ideal for people. A lot of people don't understand the restrictions that go on in shelters that make them so people can't use them. Like a lot of them, you're not allowed to be intoxicated in any way with drugs or alcohol. And some people might be like, well, that makes sense. And it's like, well, how? So you're expecting somebody to go cold turkey off their addiction in order to spend a night in a place, like without treatment? Like there's all these other rules and protocols. And if you're with a partner, you could be separated. Like all of these things that make some of the shelter spaces that are available not practical for people to use. And so the court ruled basically saying that if there are no suitable shelter spaces for people, they have a right to stay in the encampment. And so now Doug Ford is trying to find ways around that. And so we have this as a way of constantly the government attacking people who are, living with poverty, people who are suffering. Well, what about making it worse for people by TTC cops will now go undercover to catch people who try to ride for free. So trying to criminalize people who are trying to ride transit for free. And again, sometimes a lot of these people, it's not because they're trying to cheat the system. It's not because they're doing it for a good time. A lot of people can't afford to take transit, but they need to take transit. And so what they're now going to do is have cops that go undercover to try to find people that are skipping the fares. And it's a little bit more complicated than, jumping a turnstile, which you've seen down in the States in the subway systems. And this article will mention it. But then this gets into a lot of biases, a lot of racial profiling. Who do you think these cops will harass and ask the most about, like, did you pay for your fare? It's going to be based on their biases, their racial profiling. Also, well, that person looks poor, so therefore we're going to ask them if they paid versus the person who is, prepped up in a business suit type thing. Like it targets very specific people. So this is from Blog.to. Starting on Wednesday, certain TTCs, so that's the Toronto Transit Commission, I believe, fare inspectors will begin to patrol the transit system and issue tickets without uniforms as part of the agency's ongoing effort to curb fare evasion. The undercover approach was previously tested in 2018 and reintroduced 3 weeks ago with plainclothes inspectors who educated those found to be riding illegally through the transit network. They were telling people, you need to be paying for your fares. They weren't charging people, but they were saying, you need to pay. They're educating people on how to use the new system. Okay. The TTC estimated that $140 million is lost to fare evasion annually and argues that having inspectors patrol in plain clothes will help to reduce those losses. You know what? Here's a bold idea. Transit should be free. Public transit should be free. Then you wouldn't have to worry about that. Tickets for fare evasion range from $235 to $425, depending on the nature of the incident. So for skipping something that's a few dollars, you can be charged hundreds of dollars. And again, the people most likely to try to do the fare evasion are people who are already living with poverty. And so now you're going to charge that person living with poverty hundreds of dollars because they needed to go somewhere on transit. While the TTC receives considerable operating funds from City, we rely heavily on the fare box to support our operations. When people don't pay, that impacts our ability to increase service and keep fare prices low, says TTC CEO Greg Percy. We prefer all customers to pay for their rides rather than issue tickets. At the same time, we have to let people know we're serious. Undercover inspectors will carry IDs and equipment and be equipped with body-worn cameras to record customer interactions, because we all know how well body cams work and how often they tend to not work. This new approach is the second fare evasion initiative implemented by TTC this fall. Back in September, the transit agency began eliminating the no-tap gates at subway stations to capture lost fares, and collectors were redeployed to assist customers who required help with gates. However, not everyone is in favor of this new initiative, including TTC Riders, a membership-based organization of transit riders in Toronto. The TTC should be a welcoming public service for everyone. Plainclothes fare inspectors is a mistake that will fuel conflict and an environment of mistrust that could be abused, the organization wrote in a statement following the release of the TTC's plan. Just going to get down to here to make it really... This is one of the biggest problems with this. TTC rider statement on plainclothes fare inspectors. Does the TTC really expect transit riders to hand over their credit and debit cards to strangers claiming to be fare inspectors? Yeah. There's so much wrong with this, and it's hard to know where to start. If the point of fare enforcers is to encourage people not to pay fares, why be in plain clothes? What would not wearing a uniform accomplish that wearing one wouldn't? Yeah. How are you supposed to trust? So if somebody in plain clothes starts harassing you about like, oh, how did you get on here? Show me proof that you've paid for it. Where's your credit card? Where's your debit card to prove that you've paid to come on here? How are you supposed to know who this person is? Like, it just leads to a lot of really potentially bad things happening. But it's not just this, where they want more cops. It's also the PC government wants to bring armed police officers back into all Ontario schools. Here's why I know that is not a good intervention. Let's address violence in schools before it happens. Guns don't end violence. And this is from NDP MPP Jill Andrew. Yeah, let's have more police in the transit system, more police in schools. What could possibly go wrong? It's like, if only there was an example of how this goes wrong somewhere nearby, like, you know, almost like what you would call a neighbor, like maybe a southern neighbor, like maybe a whole bunch of examples down there of why this is a bad idea.
As a child and youth worker, teacher, and equity advisor, I want to thank every adult in our schools who continue to give their level best to uplift our students and to work towards their social, emotional, and academic success, despite chronic underfunding of education and understaffing by this Conservative government. The government member has tabled a motion that in effect calls for the return of armed police officers into all of our Ontario public schools. I cannot support this problematic motion, as there is no evidence indicating that the presence of police in schools ends violence. But what evidence has shown is that police in schools can and has led to racial profiling, over-policing of predominantly black students. Militarizing our students is not the answer to ending violence. And militarizing our schools as well is not the answer. Guns do not end violence. We need to be prioritizing violence prevention before the violence occurs. In June of 2022, the interim Toronto Police Chief James Raymer apologized to black community members as race-based data validated what many of us in the black community had long known through experience, that there was and is anti-black racism in the institution of policing, and that black folks are statistically more likely to be stopped, to receive use of force, assumed to be acting criminally, have a gun pointed at us, or be killed in an encounter with police than our white counterparts. This isn't about saying that all cops are bad. That would be ignorant. This is a critique of the policing institution and how its systems view blackness and black and brown bodies, which inevitably invades the belief systems of many officers, including even BIPOC officers. Many children and youth, parents, teachers, education workers, and community-based advocates and organizations like Policing Free Schools have spoken out across our province against police in schools programs. It's how we got our SRO program abolished at the TDSB. Studies from the Ontario College of Teachers, Ontario Human Rights Commission, and the Ontario Alliance of Black School Educators have shown police presence in schools does not make the classroom safer, especially for many BIPOC students who have repeatedly reported feeling uncomfortable and intimidated by the police. I welcome all MPPs to read the Ontario NDP document, End Police Violence, Invest in Black, Indigenous and Racialized Lives, and Ontario NDP Commitment to Actions. That's how we solve violence before it occurs. Let's invest in evidence-based supports in our schools, a better education funding formula, more education workers, and mental health supports, and let's also address the issues in community, like tackling housing, job and financial insecurity, student hunger and poverty that have a direct impact on how our schools function.
Thank you. All this does is add stress to certain groups of people. It targets certain groups of people. There's way too many biases in the police system right now and what for? Like, what is the goal? What's the objective? Like, what is the problem in our schools right now where, Doug Ford is thinking we need to bring police officers back into school? What's happening? I haven't heard that, schools have suddenly become crime hubs. Like, to be fair, I might be out of it. I don't pay attention to what happens in schools because I don't go to school. But I haven't been seeing things in the news that makes it seem like things are just so out of control in our schools right now that, oh no, we need to do something. Like, I don't know, add more cops. Nothing good will come of this. Having police officers in school, nothing good comes of that. It just, it makes certain groups of people feel like they're constantly being scrutinized and watched and puts them on edge of, what if I do something wrong? Because again, it's certain kids, black and brown kids, that will be targeted the most. And as I've shown in this live stream and plenty of live streams, it's not very balanced on who the cops go after, because you have pro-Palestinian protesters where 14 people get arrested at, a protest with only 100 people. But then you have a protest with 20,000 pro-Israeli protesters. No one gets arrested. The cops pick and choose, and they have their own biases on how they apply the law. You have way too many people with their own personal biases that will be applying the law not in an equal fashion. It's never in an equal fashion. It's never across the board. It is based on whoever they feel like charging and whoever they feel like, oh, they're just a good little kid and we need to let them off the hook. They're going through a rough patch, that's all. Absolutely ridiculous.